and it's really an honor to be here at Thammasat as a visitor and to be back in Thailand. I stood in this room about 5 years ago talking about what eventually became a book that came out last year, Navigation by Judgment. And in some ways, the experience of that book is kind of where this set of research ideas comes from, right? So, and I should say, by the way, this is very early stage work. As the abstract that went out with this, I hope, says, we have kind of a little bit of preliminary data to talk about, but this is going to be a talk about sort of theory, design, the questions we're asking, etc., not one that presents empirical findings and then asks you to help us interrogate them. But in some ways, frankly, in my view, that's the time when it's most exciting and most helpful to get the input of wise folks such as yourselves. And so, to that previous project on Navigation by Judgment, as the subtitle indicates, it's about why and when top-down management doesn't work, right? And the argument essentially is that when we can't measure and monitor well from above, we are better off trusting the agency, trusting the discretion of agents in the field, right? That sometimes reporting and controls undermine performance, even when they seek to enhance it. And as I talked about this project in various settings, at aid agencies, met to ministers and governments, at academic seminars, etc., I discovered again and again that people have an intuition that I don't share, to be honest, right? And that intuition is that relying on people is dangerous because people generally don't want good things, right? Or at least sometimes they don't want good things, right? And it turns out that I never realized I had this kind of assumption built into my way of seeing the world until I started to talking to people about it. And it really struck me, I was talking to, I won't name the country, but I was talking to a deputy minister of development, sort of the number 2 in a OECD country's development program. And she said to me, Dan, I'm convinced that maybe we should give more power to our people, right? Our country's people in the field. But we wouldn't want to go beyond that. When we think about developing country governments, I mean, can we really trust the folks who are there, right? And I have to be honest, I don't share that prior, right? I don't think let me put it this way, I have no basis for believing it to be the case that public servants of OECD countries are going to be systematically different than public servants of developing countries, right? That said, I do think that it's an empirical question, and one that, as I looked around the world, I realized we have precious little evidence on, right? And that's in some ways where this next set of projects comes from. So, when we think about bureaucracy, so this image on the top comes from just Google imaging search, the word bureaucracy, over the weekend, right? And this is, in some ways, the least offensive picture I could come up with, in the sense that most pictures of bureaucrats, when you type in the word bureaucrat, give you a kind of negative perception, or at best, a kind of faceless entity, right? So here, what's really salient in this, so what's really salient to me in this image is kind of the paper is the fact that people have form, but no kind of, sort of detail to their features, right? These are faceless, almost nameless professions. And I think when we think about people being good, so then I Googled, people are good, right? And or bureaucrats are good. And what I came up with is this, the country singer Luke Bryan and his new song, Most People Are Good, right? And what really strikes me about this photo is that, like most depictions of people being good, it gives them a face, right? So that is to say, when we think positively about folks, right, we tend to give them an image, we tend to animate them, etc. My next step, of course, was to Google for fairness and balance, people are evil, right? And see what came up there. And interestingly, the top results there are all about the kind of contingent nature of goodness, right? So as Ajahn Chayani very, very kindly framed in, my research is all about sort of how people and structures interact, right? And this from Philip Zimbardo, famous for the Stanford prison experiment, where students were asked to kind of to play the role of guards and of prisoners. There's some debate about the experiment itself, but putting that aside for a second, you know, he argues that good people can be induced, seduced, and initiated into behaving in evil ways. And hit number 2 here in Google Images is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, long a political prisoner in Russia, who argues that there aren't really evil people and good people. There are people, and people who can be good or evil, right? And I find this a particularly remarkable statement from somebody who spent decades in a Soviet gulag, who might be particularly disposed to see particular people as so. Look, to kind of place this work in broader context, you know, this is part for me of a broader thrust into thinking about what I'm tentatively calling mission-driven bureaucrats. You know, in part, in kind of an economics frame, I think that our turn as a discipline towards institutions and organizations is a great one. And I think our use of the principal agent model, which at times I believe constrains us, is often a very good thing. But if we think in terms of that principal agent model, it strikes me that we do a heck of a lot of thinking and theorizing about the principal side of that model, and not so much about the agent side of that model. And I'm here to suggest that maybe there would be benefits from thinking up from the agent rather than down from the principal as we think about kind of what's going on in the world and how we explain the world. And so in political science, there was a famous book about 20 years ago called Bringing the State Back In by Theda Skocpol, right? This work is about bringing the people who act in the name of the state back in to our understanding of what it means to bring the state back in to our understanding of reality. So I think public sector jobs are often second-best settings where discretion is critical to good performance. In part, that's because they're often multitask environments in which only some tasks are observable. It's the rare public servant, I would argue, who performs a job where they have a clear summary statistic via which we can kind of orient what they do. In addition, public servants very often have multiple principals, right? They have multiple people they are reporting to, and that means that if there's any difference in objective functions between those principals, there's going to be slack that emerges naturally, whether you wanted to or not, right? So that is to say, even where technical realities of the task do not mean that discretion is a key part of doing the job well, political realities of the task may make it so anyway, right? And only one of these needs be true for discretion being an important part of the stew. And you know, building off kind of Agnon to Roll 97. So on real and formal authority. So the argument there is when you want to know something about what's going on the ground, you have to give the people on the ground the ability to make use of that information. Otherwise, they have no incentive to collect it, right? So if you think of the public service, especially where public servants are not sitting in an office, say in Bangkok, but actually in the field, as one wherein we think local information, local understanding is at least an important input into doing a good job, that implies, it seems to me, real authority in the field to kind of allow the agency to collect this asymmetric information. That's closely related to the idea that soft information matters here. That things that we can perceive but are hard to codify, hard to transmit up a hierarchy, might be essential to doing the job well. I should say, by the way, feel free to stop me at any time. You know, not that you need to feel compelled to, but you know, feel free to ask questions along the way. So, look, I think we're often in a second best world, one in which optimal strategy is not to attempt to monitor or contract directly on observables, but rather to kind of think about how to get the best we can through a sort of discretionary channel. right? And I just want to point out that this is, contra what I see as the move in development towards pay-for-performance schemes, which I think are going to be optimal schemes for a narrow set of projects, but difficult to apply for many, I might argue, most of what we want the public sector to do in most of the settings where we want the public sector to do it. I'm happy to talk more about that. So, I think this feeds into a broader bureaucratic turn in development economics, at least as I see it. So I think we have increasingly come to the understanding of the field that management practice matters. Think of Bloom and Van Riemen and the World Management Survey and everything that has sort of led to, right? Everything that has come from that. We also increasingly are coming to understand that agents respond differentially to incentives in acquiring jobs on the kind of selection in margin, right? There are a series of papers that are randomized controlled trials that change the nature of job advertisements and show that in some settings it matters quite a bit, and in some settings it matters quite little how you advertise the job, right? So you can take the same job and say, this job is about a good career and a stable income. You can take the same job and say, this job is about helping people. And it turns out you sometimes, but not always, attract different kinds of people with those two ads that lead to different kinds of performance on the job, depending on how much discretion matters. And I think thus, kind of in the shadow, is telling us something about who the agents are or can be, and why that's sometimes quite difficult. This is sort of in contrast to, as I see it at least, the mainstream focus on improving monitoring technology and tying monitoring to rewards. And I have here in mind, kind of paradigmatically, the work on cameras in schools and cameras in hospitals, which seek to monitor attendance of folks. I have a paper with Lant Pritchett that came out last year, or maybe earlier this year, in which we basically say, look, cameras in classrooms are going to be great at getting teachers to show up. They're going to not help us very much once they've shown up. And guess what? We also can't make them show up twice. That is to say, the margin of showing up is completely exhausted by getting them to show up in the first place. There's no additional marginal gain to be had. And now, in fact, we might have made the job worse for some of the sort of welfare-oriented teachers who might be now more prone to exit, don't like being monitored, etc. If there was a camera that monitored the time I showed up in my office every day, I might feel a little bit less positively about my job, etc. And we've seen mixed effects of these kinds of interventions, even in the short term, because of course bureaucrats are great at thwarting the system in various ways when it does not serve their interests. There's also lots of evidence of distortions born of multitasking, let me say. These are just a couple of the many studies I could have put here. That is to say, even in jobs that seem fairly straightforward, like collecting taxes or preparing unemployed people for new jobs, job training programs, it turns out that when we build pay-for-performance schemes or when we incentivize on particular monitored outcomes, we of course get more, as Holmstrom and Milgram would have told us, we of course get more of that outcome, but we get none of the other things we might care about. So in the tax collector case, revenues go up. It turns out revenues go up because enforcement gets more insistent in ways that may violate the law, right? So basically, tax collections go up because tax collectors work harder to shake down the people with money who might be able to pay the taxes in this particular setting. That obviously is good for revenues. It might not be good for, say, the relationship between the governed and the governed. Might not be good for kind of society. So I think increasingly we are seeing hints that point towards discretion as potentially positive, not poisonous, that see the bureaucrat as potentially part of the solution, not just part of the problem. And I should say, I've been framing positive things about bureaucrats. I am not here to suggest that there is no bureaucrat who steals. I'm not here to suggest that there is no bureaucrat who engages in corrupt action. The question here is one of balance, and one of whether the answer is removing discretion or changing the setup and changing who that bureaucrat is, right, in ways that that lead to a different outcome consistently. So Bandiera et al. Find that even in a verifiable, so if you would ask me, what's the most verified, Dan Honig, what is the most verifiable public sector task that you can think of that happens consistently across countries? I think I would have said to you, procurement of basic goods, right? So buying paper, buying pens, buying petroleum, right? So this is super monitorable, right? We can see the quotes, we can see the prices paid, right? We can see the quality of the good because it has to meet some basic standard. If we're buying A4 paper, look, there's better or worse A4 paper, but at the end of the day, it's A4 paper, right? And I think it is remarkable to me that even in this setting, Bandiera et al. Find that a system that pays for performance over the medium term does less well than one that gives procurement agents more autonomy in Pakistan, right? So basically, if I'd been smart, I would have put a central graph from their study here so I could show it to you. But basically, what happens is that if you look at prices paid on the y-axis, what happens with pay for performance is you get like a really big decline in prices paid in period 1, and then it climbs way above the control group, right? What you get with autonomy is a slower initially, but steady decline in prices paid that then is sustained below the control group in this RCT. I think it's a great paper if it's of any interest to any folks here. We also see that performance incentives are more distortionary with ambiguous and unverifiable projects. I'm thinking here of Rasool and Rogers working in Nigeria, and their work with Martin Williams in Ghana, which basically says the more discretionary the task, the more inherently, right, the more unverifiable the task, the more performance incentives work against you, the more autonomy is associated with better performance. And so, in some ways, this comes down to the question of what are our options when the important stuff can't be seen, which I want to say is a lot of the time. How do we think about the personnel economics of the state and how to improve things on the margin in that setting? And my answer is we should start by looking at the people involved. As much depends on their agencies. And you see the very bottom of the screen, by the way? Yeah, okay, good. Good talking to you. So, for some of you, I suspect as I've been talking, you've been thinking already about this concept of mission match, right? Which comes from Besley and Gattak and speaks a little bit to the dynamics I'm talking about here. So, mission match is conventionally thought of as the degree to which agents match the objective functions of their principles, right? So you've got a boss, just basic principal agent there. You've got a boss, the greater the alignment of you and your boss's objective functions, the more is a good idea for your boss to give you slack, right? If you and your boss want exactly the same things, then your boss doesn't have to worry about monitoring you in the same way as they would if you want different things. And the more different they are, the more monitoring is a good idea. So this paper has, as of last Thursday or something when I looked it up, something like 1,600 citations. I would argue that most of the citations treat it in the way that I just said, rather than the way that the paper talks about it, right? So that is to say, this is from the abstract of the paper. The paper says, mission-oriented organizations are frequently staffed by motivated agents who subscribe to the mission, right? So that's an alignment between an organization and an agent, not between a principal and an agent. This paper studies incentives in such contexts and emphasizes the role of matching the mission preferences of principals and agents in increasing organizational efficiency. But from this point on in the paper just assumes that principals hold the objective function of the organization. That whatever the organization wants, management is perfectly aligned to do it, right? Which, if you have ever been in any organization, including, I suspect, with no particular evidence, Thammasat's economics department, right? There will sometimes be misalignment between management and the mission of the organization. People are not perfect holders of kind of the organizational mission, and they have their own incentives, their own concerns, and so on. And so, again, I have no Thammasat specific information. I am merely saying that it is true of all organizations, all agencies, all departments, right? So, so there are three things that matter here. There's the organization's mission, there are the principals who manage that mission, and there are the agents. And we can imagine problems at any step in the chain here, right? That is to say, it is possible to have the principals be the problem, that the principals can stand between the agents and the organization's mission. And if you think it matters what people care about on the way in, I would argue this is particularly the case, right? So, I'm going to tell you in just a moment about a setting in Detroit, which is my hometown, where child protective services officers come into the job because they really care about helping kids. They discover that in practice, they cannot in fact help kids on the job, and then they leave, right? Is that better or worse for the kids of Detroit? I would argue it is worse. I would argue it is good to have the people who want to help kids be the people who have the job of helping the kids. And I would also argue that almost everyone who I stopped on the street would agree with that statement, and we would find economic seminar rooms to be a place of surprising disagreement from the general orientation. So, as I mentioned, this is part of kind of a broader thrust. That thrust is on mission-driven bureaucrats. I have a series of empirical projects which I'll talk about briefly before turning to Thailand for the rest of the talk. My main hypotheses for that work as a whole, which I hope will someday, not so long from now, be a book of same name, are that the motivation of agents matters, right? Not just in the statistical, but in a substantively significant sense. Very much echoing our conversation just before the talk run about treatment effects and the need to think about substantive importance, not just sort of whether you have stars on your regression analysis. Treatment with supportive management practices and mission-driven peers can help, right? So people aren't fixed types. So my model of the world is not one in which there are good people and there are bad people, and we want to get the good people in and the bad people out. Sometimes that's true, right? But when we say there are good people, I think what we mean is there are people who are now acting in good ways. And when we say that there are bad people, we mean there are people who are now acting in bad ways. So sometimes those good and bad ways are not going to be changeable at the margin, in which case we should absolutely think about selection in and out, right? But for most of us, there might be some saints, might be some sinners out there. My view is that for most of us, we're somewhere in between, right? And that what we are exposed to has something to do with what we then do, right? So peers matter, management practice matters in motivating or demotivating us, in pushing us in different directions. Management practice also affects selection. It affects selection right? In the sense that, take my Detroit example of a moment ago, if a job seems like not a very good job to do, fewer people are going to apply to that job, right? And if they do show up, they're more likely to leave, right? So it affects selection out as well. The opposite is also true. If a workplace is great, think about the kind of like, I don't know, almost hagiography around Google and Facebook and sort of tech campuses these days, right? It seems to all be about sort of ping pong tables and free food and those kinds of things. The idea being like, hey, the conditions of this job are great, right? You have a fair bit of autonomy. You get to do lots of fun things. These are obviously not public sector jobs, but I think the same logic applies, that selection both in who applies, the fact that my students in America are super excited about these jobs, right? And out, the fact that turnover is quite low, has something to do with the nature of the conditions of it. And so, this kind of selection dynamic can be adverse or positive on that, depending on management practice, and of course the pool of recruits, right? So, it doesn't matter if the job is going to attract really lovely people if there are no really lovely people who want the job, right? So, the extensive margin of what the sort of possible potential workforce looks like matters too. And for jobs where we can't tightly manage by observable and verifiable data, things we can see and count, high performance is associated with an equilibrium of bureaucrats who care about impact and an organization's mission, supportive management practices, and career concerns which are aligned with outcomes, not process. that's different than pay for performance in the sense that career concerns and their assessment can also involve soft information, right? So it doesn't merely have to be what we count, how we decide who to promote, and indeed in most systems it isn't. So yes. So briefly, I promise Thailand's coming in just one more slide. So non-Thai empirical settings for this kind of broad base of work. I've dug up raw data for administrative surveys of civil servants conducted by others, not conducted by me, across 7 countries, right? And there I'm looking at kind of management practice, motivation equilibrium, and the difference of tasks by verifiability, right? Those are all cross-sectional measures. So I can't tell you anything about changes at the margin. All I can tell you is equilibria exist, right? And are different than each other. But that itself seems to me an interesting stylized fact. In Bangladesh, in conjunction with Adnan Khan and Tim Besley of the Mission Match, Besley and Gatak, we are doing an RCT, we hope. We have at least done a baseline survey so far. We'll see what the government says about the results here, of Bangladeshi engineers, where we're looking at the effect of motivation on performance. In our baseline survey, we have an effort task, and we're looking at sort of different motivational messaging on performance in a kind of toy effort task. The preliminary results suggest that indeed motivation matters to performance here. And what we hope to do, our preliminary conversations with the relevant minister have been about potentially changing the job of, it would be 1,000 Bangladeshi engineers, to give them more autonomy, more decision rights in the field. The idea being, we now have a survey of baseline motivation. We're going to alter management practice, right? Then we're going to see whether different people use that autonomy differently, right? And compare them to a control group, which is not, of course, given the difference in autonomy treatment. In India, doing a survey of commercial tax collectors by IRB agreement, I have to say, a large Indian state. So in some large Indian state, which will remain nameless, doing a survey of tax collectors, where we see capacity, effort, and overall performance. There we're getting nuanced ratings from managers of people's ability, people's effort level, and people's overall performance differently, right? So what I think is novel there is we're teasing out the parts of performance in a kind of soft information weighting way, in a way that's subjective, of course, because how else could you get at such elements? But that allows the kind of separation of the elements of performance. In Detroit, Child Protective Services, as I mentioned, looking at differential exit of the motivated, treatment by management practice, in this case bad management practice, and selection in and out. And in Ghana, looking at a fast-stream civil service program. That's a program that takes, so it's a program that takes 20 people from about 600 applicants and gives them a kind of fast entry route to management in the civil service. And there, nicely, they of course have tests and interviews which are scored, and then they take the top X people every year. So we can do a regression discontinuity. We can compare people just above and just below the line that are selected, and say all these people are really excited about the civil service. What does it mean to actually show up in the civil service? And is that different depending on what unit you show up in? So having visited a few of these units, right? I can imagine that there's some offices where I would show up and think, okay, this is an exciting job, I can do meaningful things here. And there's some units where that might be a little bit less the case, and that might change my motivation in each of those two cases. So those are all not in Thailand. Let's turn to Thailand. So why am I here? And I promise we're done talking about not Thailand for the rest of this, rest of these remarks. So, well, first, I suspect many of you have thought harder about this work than I, and I know it's led to a kind of complicated conversation in Thai public administration, as I understand it. But this notion that Thailand is a bureaucratic polity has some implications for thinking about the bureaucrats themselves and whether they're going to matter. That is to say, in a place where we could imagine bureaucrats run the show, relatively speaking, we would imagine who those bureaucrats are matters even more, right? In a tightly controlled system, there's less scope for influencing policy than there is in one in which bureaucrats are, at times, effectively policy setters, policy makers in addition, or rather than being policy takers, depending on how we think about it. In addition, this is a place where central government matters quite a bit. So if I looked at middle-income countries, I imagine that I would find Thailand in the top quartile in terms of the importance of central government, right? So, you know, I've never actually done that exercise until just this very moment, but, you know, along with kind of Turkey, I don't know, maybe a few others that I could think of, Indonesia, Thailand is near the top in terms of how much the central state matters, and thus how much we could imagine central bureaucrats matter. It's also a place where it seems to me there are quite a number of overlapping and unclear mandates, right? So in doing just the preliminary work on this project, I had the experience over and over of talking to someone in the Thai public service about their job and having them say, oh, it's clear, my responsibility is X and Y and Z. And the first couple times I thought, oh, that sounds pretty clear. And then after I talked to enough people, I ended up saying, well, I could be totally wrong, but when I talked to that gentleman over there, it sounded like his job was X. And so if your job isn't that the same, can you help me tease those things out, right? And of course, often the story was a lot longer than the initial account had been. In addition, you have people working together to get things done who have very different principles and different structural career concerns and need to coordinate. I'm going to say more about this if this doesn't make sense immediately in the moments to come. So I suspect, so now we're turning chiefly into material that most of you as Thai citizens are more deeply familiar with than I as someone attempting to learn the system. And so please correct my errors, and I ask for your forbearance in any of the many things I'm sure I may get wrong over the next few slides. So, you know, this is a quick description of where Ampur-Level sit in the system, which is my focus here, which is our focus here. I should say, I should have framed in at the very beginning of the talk, May, who's sitting in the front here, is working with me on this research. May was a student of mine in the US, now working here in Thailand for UNICEF, and also helping out with this work. So when I say we, we're the we bunch. So we are thinking about Ampur here. There are, of course, 878 Ampur in Thailand. And, you know, the Ampur is basically the unit in red here sorted, right? So that is to say the district depicted here is the Ampur underneath the province. And that district, as you can tell, what I like about this, so this is a dissertation written by a Thai PhD student in the US, right? And what I like about this is how hard a very smart individual found it to explain the Thai administrative system in a simple graph, right? And I also quite like the definition of lines, right? That to explain this system, you need a kind of strongly control line, right? A kind of control and steering, which I'm going to call a weakly control line, and a support and collaboration line, even to start getting at sort of the relationship between these units, right? And so as we dig into our Ampurs, first let me talk about the setting where we are looking at Ampurs at the moment. So we're looking at six Ampur in Khon Kaen. The Kola logo down here is to remind me to say that our access to these Ampur and our understanding of them was deeply aided by the folks at Khon Kaen University's College of Cultural Administration, and so I just want to acknowledge that. And so, in part through their links, we met with the Puwa Rachakan Changwan, and we basically said, look, we'd love to work in some Ampur, right? And he said, great, I've got some Ampur for you, right? In fact, it so happened, this was total coincidence, that we were meeting immediately after a meeting that he had had with all of the Nai Ampur. So he said, not only do I have some Ampur for you, let me bring them in right now and introduce you, right? So, so he introduced us to 3 Ampur. there are reasons we might imagine that that is a non-random selection, right? That if somebody comes from the outside and says, hey, I'd really love to understand how the province you control works, why don't you pick some Ampur at random for me? That you might be trying to be as random as possible. It still is probably the case that what comes to mind, even with the best of intentions, are folks who you think are relatively high performing. And that's obviously a problem for this empirical strategy. So what we did is we took the 3 Ampur that he suggested, of course, and then we matched on demographic characteristics each of those Ampur to a randomly selected other Ampur, went back and said, hey, we've decided we want to do 6 Ampur. Can we get your permission to speak to these other 3 Ampur as well, under the logic that it's a little bit awkward to say, no, 3 was fine, 6 is terrible. Or, no, how about you choose another Ampur? And indeed that worked, and we then were able to speak to the other 3 as well. And so the ones in red are the ones he selected for us, the ones in green are the ones we matched. So, here's one pairing, right? So what we're trying to do here is match based on NSO data, based on the agricultural census, and based on NSO data, poverty incidence, poverty gap, severity of poverty, Gini, etc. We also tried to say a little bit geographically proximate, but it turned out we had to relax that to get anywhere close on the numbers, frankly. So here's one set, here's the second set, and here is the third set. So we have here 3 Ampur. Yep.
Just very quick question. Percent agriculture, is that percent employment or percent of GDP?
I think it's percent of yeah, I think it's percent of holdings. I think it's percent of the physical area. It's percent of the physical area of the Ampur that is agricultural.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I didn't either, but then you can figure out. So that's the percent of what the territory does.
The percent of the territory, not the percent of the.
Okay.
Yeah. And I have to say, by the way, in Konkan in general, it shows my priors. I am surprised to find that, like, so I think the Ampur, I think these 2 Ampur are in the top 5, right? So, like, that is to say, in Janwat Konkan, which I think or had thought as a very agricultural place, right? I think the top Ampur has something like 8% agricultural holdings, right? So Konkan is surprisingly urban, according to the agricultural census.
Yeah. If you talk about percent of land, like 3 use, right? I think it's a bit. I'm not sure. I just observed it is quite low.
I agree. So I guess my reaction to that is to say, like, this is the government's data, So I could be wrong. I also, I mean, my where I started there was I find these numbers surprising. I totally agree.
I would be if I look at it, to me looks more like the percentage of GDP
that is agriculture. It's possible I misunderstand what the term is. We will go back and look at it. And so, yeah, and that would explain why. So, it could well be a very good question.
Or it could just be half the land isn't being used for anything.
Well,
which would like double those percentages right there. Okay, sorry.
Awesome. No, it's a good question, and it's one I should absolutely have an answer for. I should say this is not just my first time presenting about the Thai work. This is also my first time presenting about the project as a whole, and so I appreciate this opportunity to talk and think about all of the details. So let's dig into those Ampur. So the Ampur is, if you ask a Nai Ampur, let's put it this way, right? So if you ask the Nai Ampur, I think every Nai Ampur we have spoken to at some point says to be the Nai Ampur is to be the head of the Ampur. That's what the job is. The job is I run the Ampur. That's the explanation as I understand it, right? And up here at the top, of course, is Bomunsuk, which also comes up a lot of time as people talk about things, and is at least my stand-in for kind of like government-wide organizational mission, in the sense that this is what people say the goal is, over and over again. If I say, what's the goal of the whole enterprise, this is what they say, right? So when we talk about mission match as organization, principle, and agent, right? That's the organization part, as I see it, right? The government-wide organization. So, okay, great, Ampur, he's the head of the Ampur. What does that mean exactly? What is it, when he says he's the head of the Ampur, what is he the head of? So, there are a few cases where it's like super clear, and at least to my, limited intellect makes a lot of sense, right? So that is to say, there's a Palat Ampur, right, a secretary or a deputy Ampur, who also works for the Ministry of Interior, Department of Provincial Administration. In preliminary interviews with these folks, Palat Ampur say things like, someday I want to become an Ampur. Yes, I do what the Ampur tells me. We work in the same Ampur. We're part of the team. I'm his deputy, right? Makes perfect sense. Classic Bavarian hierarchy, career concerns super clear, right? Super hierarchical, no problem. Fits all of what I think of as the common models of classical bureaucracy. Then, there are other people who work for the Ministry of Interior, where again I'm adopting the dotted line thing from the previous from the dissertation, right? Where like there's not quite control, but they're all still working for the Ministry of the Interior. There's like the Community Development Officer who's working for the Ministry of the Interior but a different department, and there's the Tongtina Ampur who is actually has the job of intermediating between the Ampur government and the Tambon government in a variety of ways. But that person does not report, sort of reports to the Ampur, but also reports to a different department, right? Is a employee of a different department in the Ministry of the Interior, right? And this turns out to be even the relatively simpler case because, and these folks are all reporting to the Ministry of the Interior, but Ajahn Wasan here gives us good reason for thinking that might not be the most important factor here, right? That we should think of the Thai state as one typified by departmentalism, where the department, rather than the ministry, is supreme. So the implication there is that, okay, they're all reporting to different, the same ministry, but they're reporting to kind of different parts of that ministry. And so already we might have kind of not multiple principles in the way we normally think about it. So of course each of these people probably also has multiple principles, but we have people who are trying to coordinate who have different principles and are agents of different principles. And this is, again, still the simpler case, right? So there's also the district health officer, the district agriculture officer, the district livestock officer, who by the way reports to a different department in the Ministry of Agriculture than does the district agriculture officer. There's the district education officer. These folks all, so when we ask Ampur who's part of your kind of senior leadership team, these folks, if they're present, have thus far always showed up as people who are present, right? There are also people, and they of course report to other ministries, right? So they're going to need to balance the kind of vertical pressures of reporting up to Bangkok and the kind of horizontal pressures. I'm going to now think of the Ampur as part of the same horizontal group as these folks, though there's differentiation inside that group, right? So then there are these other folks. There's the head of the community hospital, the head of the district police. Sometimes when we have meetings in Ampur, these folks are invited. Sometimes they were not, right? When people talk about their coordination meetings, sometimes they mention them. Sometimes we have to say, is there a community hospital in this district? The answer to which, of course, is yes, right? And then contact them that way. These folks are even less connected to the kind of Ampur team, right? And we see here kind of what I would describe potentially, though Ajahn Wasan or anyone else could tell me this is the wrong way of thinking about this. I think of this as kind of like the irrigation channels of fragmented centralism, right? So like, when you build an irrigation system, what you do is you build lots of tiny little rivulets, right? So if you look at kind of the diagram of an irrigation system, you can see big channels and then little channels going out to individual fields. And fragmented centralism, as it's been described, is about kind of the center's ability to deliver projects, but only within its own stream, right? Only within its own watercourse, which is not fully independent from, but is sufficiently independent from that we end up with these little projects, those of the other channels. So these are the kind of irrigation channels through which fragmented centralism flows. And I have to say that it took me a long time to understand what people meant in Thailand when they said area-based strategy, which is a phrase that you hear a lot. It seems to me area-based strategy is a way of saying we should think about the place holistically, right? Rather than think about what it represents to each agency. And as often the case, so Rudyard Kipling said 150, 200 years ago, no man knows England who only England knows, right? I think, it calls out an assumption baked into what it means to have a local government that I never realized was an assumption I had before, which is that having a local government is inherently about thinking about the place holistically. That's what a local government does and is. This experience, and I think the Thai system points out that it needn't be that way, that we can think about the local as an aggregation of functions as well, and that's what fragmented centralism has historically done, functioned through, etc. So, and by the way, even this is a simplification on many levels, but one of them is a number, but not all of these folks also report to Bangkok through a provincial office, right? So if you want to think about who the effective principal is, sometimes the effective principal might be the provincial person who is clearly above the Nai Ampur from the other department, or the other ministry as appropriate. So also, of course, these folks don't, so I'm going to call everyone in blue here a vertical bureaucrat. Actually, I think the folks at the province are vertical bureaucrats too, but these are Ampur-Level vertical bureaucrats, let's say, everyone in blue, right? They form a workplace. They live, they work with each other regularly. They're going to be here for years, right? Different number of years, different rotations. Depending on how rural the Ampur is, they probably don't have too much of a social life outside of the other vertical bureaucrats. That's differentially true across Ampur and across function, right? This is their community, but their career concerns point elsewhere, right? So they have these vertical and horizontal channels pulling against each other in, I think, a pretty unique sort of way, pretty novel sort of way that I don't think has been thought about systematically. So, here's a quote from an Nai Ampur: when the law doesn't indicate whose responsibility, it falls underneath the Nai Ampur, right? But, how do you then coordinate if you're the Nai Ampur or any other bureaucrat, right? How do you handle overlapping mandates? What about novel issues? In one Nai Ampur, in a preliminary interview, the Nai Ampur started talking about power patches, so which were, as I understood them, and may correct me where I get the details wrong here, but as I understood them, they were fake medical devices that were sold to people that were, kind of, I had in mind like a tobacco patch, when people are quitting tobacco that they put on, right? That were supposed to give them power and good health, right? So this medical fraud, whose responsibility is it, right? So it's a medical fraud. It's happening in the Ampur. No one's responsibility is called taking care of power patches, right? Or maybe even taking care of medical frauds. Is this the job of the community hospital? Is it the job of the district health officer? Is it the job of the community development officer? Is it the job of the Nai Ampur? Well, it's kind of the Nai Ampur's by default unless somebody else takes it. But then what's he going to do? What's he or she going to do? How are they actually going to do the thing of getting rid of the power patches if indeed that's their goal? And the last thing I just want to put on the table here is, while we are focused largely on the group in blue, Thailand, of course, has a relatively novel local governance structure as well in terms of, the Tambon level administration, the Opoto, the relationship between that Tambon administration and the heads of village, the Puyaiban, and the Puyaiban's internally elected Gamnan, right? And just the notion that you have local elections, but then age limits, right? That people come in by election. but then stay there until they reach a certain age, and that these locally elected people are then paid by the Ministry of the Interior, that they're on interior payroll, is itself a novel system that makes one, that at least on its face, raises questions about kind of bottom-up accountability and how it might be functioning in these settings, and how Ampur or other vertical bureaucrats, when they need to work in the tambons, interact with these individuals. There are, of course, many tambon in each Ampur. One of the things I want to point out here is that means that we can think of this as a kind of like nested hierarchy, right? As a hierarchical model in some sense, in that we have many tambon that have to interact with the same officers and might have different experiences, might have the same experience. And also, by the way, one upside from a research standpoint of the long tenure of these folks is that they also implicitly have the ability to compare today's X with yesterday's X. They've seen a lot of community development officers, right? They've seen a lot of Ampur, and they can talk about, if we can get them to talk about it, they can talk about the kind of differences between. So, like, you know, these structures, I have never, in my time doing field work in governments, I've never seen buildings that so speak to kind of the centralizing hand of the state as I have in Thailand, with the possible exception of Turkey. My wife is Turkish, and I have never done field work in Turkey, but actually Turkey looks much the same way. But, so this is one building. This is another building, right? So, so I would love to know the only, other than the name of the Ampur, right? The only other difference that I can spot in these photos, and it's amazing, by the way, that one of our RAs managed to have the exact same expression. I didn't ask anyone to pose here, you know, like in any particular way. So is that the flags are reversed, right? Here the Thai flag is in the center. Here it's on the side. And I'm curious whether there's like a regulation somebody didn't follow, or whether that's actually at the discretion of the Ampur. It's not going to be super central to the research, but you know, it speaks to it, right? Here's another one. Sometimes there are you know, unique local things that speak to local crafts or local place. There is in Khon Kaen, just for full disclosure, a blue version of the building as well. They're not all red. Some of them are in fact also blue, right? And you know, when folks think about local government anywhere, I think government anywhere, they tend to think of the kind of identicalness of these buildings, right? The identicalness. The government is the government, right? And indeed, if you walk into these buildings, at least the 5 or so I've been to so far, you will walk in. The bathroom will be straight in front of you. There will be some kind of advertisement on the wall on the right that speaks to the locality, right, and the place. If you make like a U-turn, essentially, you will come to the staircase. If you walk up that staircase, you will see a listing of previous Ampur, right? That listing apparently is not standardized in that these boards take a variety of physical form, right? So there's some variation here, right, in how you actually list the previous Ampur. Though it's path dependent, probably hard to change once it's begun. If you come to the top of the stairs and you turn to your left, you make kind of like another U-turn, you will come to the office of the Ampur, right? The first Ampur we came to, I said, okay, should we ask somebody where the office is? And one of our RAs, a member of our team who's been in many Ampur, said, no, there's no need to ask. Here's where it will be. And I thought, that's interesting. You know, that's an interesting fact that speaks to centralization. So if you go into that office, though, of course, not only will you discover different office decorations, you'll also encounter different people, right? So these are pictures of some of the Ampur. So this gentleman from one Ampur. Another, the Ampur is here, dressed not in uniform, but in, I don't know how to describe this dress, but dressed as he is. So here's another gentleman in uniform, right? And then here are folks who with the same instruction, right? So this wasn't intended to be part of the research design. But if you think about the setup here, the Puwa Rachakan Janwa has given an instruction, right? To the three who he selected, he gave it to them simultaneously in our presence in front of us, right? They have implemented this instruction of meeting with us and working with the research team in different ways. This is, I would argue, an interesting, if not determinative, form of variation that speaks in some ways to what's going on in the Janwa. So here's a group in one. Here's a much bigger group in another. And the Nyampur, by the way, is this one in here in this Nyampur. You know, behind these doors, which look identical, lie, I think even in our preliminary work, we're starting to see very different equilibria of coordination, very different management styles, right? Very different ways of working together or not. And indeed, in contrast, so I have to be honest, it would be hard for me to imagine, neither of these gentlemen walked outside their doorway after the meeting, right? So, you know, we said thank you, we exited, right? It's perfectly appropriate. I'm not in any way complaining about that. In one case, the Nyampur walked us downstairs, and when we tried to take our selfie of the building, right, she was like, "Oh, can I come in too? Should we do a symbol, right? Should we have some kind of you know, do something here, right?" This is a different way of reacting to a common stimulus. And so, yeah. So each Ampur, right? In each Ampur, who are we talking to? To kind of the nuts and bolts of the research. We're going to be talking to the Nyampur. We're going to be talking to all of the other vertical bureaucrats we can identify. Everyone in blue there. There are also sometimes other people. That blue is not an exhaustive list, though it's close, depending on the Ampur. There's some variation. Selected Nayok Opato and selected Gamnan and Puyapa. And in each case, we are first going to ask about what that individual, why they are doing their job, right? So what they're bringing to the job, why they came to the job, where they intend to go from the job, right? Getting some purchase on career concerns. And at the end, we're going to have a short survey of motivation as well. That's going to allow us to kind of make some quantitative comparisons as well. We're also going to talk about management practice, relations to home ministries, reporting, career concerns and promotion, etc. And interactions with others in the district. You know, with other vertical bureaucrats, for vertical bureaucrats, with the Gamnan, with the Kuyaiban, if we're talking to them, with the various vertical bureaucrats, etc. And then we're going to talk about performance, which to me is one of the weaknesses of our design as it currently sits. I'll highlight this again at the end. You know, accomplishments, what can be improved, right? So, you know, we're gonna, I feel confident that in this design, we're gonna get some decent purchase on the motivation and management relations of the bureaucrats. I am less confident that we are gonna get evidence that when I bring it to a seminar, I hope here someday in the future, if you'll have me back, right? That when I show it to you, you're gonna say, okay, I agree that that's high performance and that's low performance, you know? So we can ask them about their Ampur. We're also going to use whatever administrative data we can get on sort of changes over time. But the problem there, of course, is relatively frequent rotation and overlap between bureaucrats. It's going to make it hard to think about the kind of Ampur-Level equilibrium. You know, one strategy which we hope will work is we're going to observe, hopefully, the October meeting of each of the Ampur. So they each have a coordination meeting, which almost always immediately follows the province level meeting, right? So to the extent that the province level meeting issues any kind of instruction, which it often but not always does, if it does, then we hope to be able to compare implementation of that instruction across the various Ampur. Of course, we'd have to get a little bit lucky for that to work perfectly. And frankly, we are also concerned about the fact that they often all have the meetings on the same day, which will make it impossible to go to all of the meetings in the same month. So, you know, and hopefully you can hear the kind of way we're thinking about this, but also that there is potentially room for further improvement, which we would love. We would love your wisdom. So, what kind of comparisons is this strategy going to allow? Also, at the district level, comparing across districts, so comparing Ampur to each other, right? We hope to
be able to see something about the equilibrium of coordination and motivation that emerges and how that's different. They're different from one another and how that relates to performance, right? So the effective end there is the Ampur. So here it's 6, right? This is not big numbers, right? So, but we can also think cross-sectionally at the individual level within district, right? So in each district, there are, somewhere between 6 and 10, 6 and 12 vertical bureaucrats. And we can think about sort of the variation in their motivation, in their challenges, maybe in their effectiveness, though it's going to be easier to see kind of the right-hand side than the left-hand side in that sense. We're also going to be able to think cross-sectionally at the role level across district. So there are 6 district agriculture officers. There are 6 community development officers, etc. And we can think about how they vary at doing the same job in different places, or what at least structurally looks like the same job. And then within district, within task, so as I mentioned when talking about the Gamnan, we hope to get some basis of comparison at how this district's community development officer compares to last time's district community development officer compares to 2 times ago. All right. So how is this going to contribute, I hope, to the whole of the project? So I hope to get some purchase on motivation matters combined with process tracing. I hope to get nuance out of these stories that helps us to understand what's going on. So things like the power patch, right? So actual accounts of things that happen and the way people react that brings this kind of narrative to life. I hope to get more on the interaction between bureaucrats and peer effects, including bureaucrats with different career concerns, which is quite unusual, right? And how that sort of tension emerges and plays out. On that tension between welfare delivery and career concerns, and some purchase on self-reported management practice differences. So already in 1 or 2 cases, folks have said something to us about how sort of the rules from Bangkok get in the way of doing good things. To be honest, in the examples they've given, I do not always agree that the thing it sounds like they wanted to do in fact constitutes a welfare enhancing thing, right? But that's in some ways a separate question, right? So there is tension here, at least in some folks' minds. The tasks here are differentially unverifiable, right? So they're doing things that are differentially hard to monitor from above. And so we might get some purchase in that regard. And maybe we can see kind of some potential selection, some intent to leave, and ways that management practice affect career trajectories. And motivation for the job, and in the job, and differences. So in terms of outputs to come out of this research work, so I think this is going to be qualitative data for the book manuscript, right? So frankly, one of the advantages of Thailand, as I see it, is it's a country that some people will consider a developing country, and some people will consider a middle income or developed country, right? And that in some ways bridges, in some ways ties together the various other empirical settings, if I'm honest, in a way that I think will be helpful in a narrative sense. I also could imagine 2 papers coming out of this work that are standalone papers. One examining the differences between high-performing and low-performing Ampur. So this is going to be like a causes of effects kind of paper, right? For those of you in the kind of like inside baseball journal world in which academics live, this feels to me not well identified enough to be an 8J applied paper. This is not getting into that, right? But more kind of like rural development, something like that. Maybe JDE, that also seems like a stretch. The second, which we were talking about just before, was differences in the state's orientation towards citizens. So we've been talking about Khon Kaen here for the last little bit. We also believe we have an opportunity to work with a few Ampur in Surat Thani, right? We could imagine, of course, the sort of underlying politics and political orientation of those 2 places are different from one another, right? We might perceive the Thai state to perceive its citizens differently across those divides. If that turns out to be the case, I wonder if that wouldn't be an interesting paper too. We have not actually, we have kind of set up the pathway in Surat Thani, but we have not yet proceeded down the path. And one thing that I would love the reaction of the folks in this room to is whether that's an interesting comparison. And if so, how to make it richer, the way, and maybe even the way to ask questions that then become slightly more sensitive, if we want to ask about that directly rather than merely observe differences. Just some initial quotes, observations of interest. I'm coming to the end. But first, it does seem to me from these initial conversations that there are equilibria of coordination. One Ampur said, by way of differentiating his Ampur, some Ampur are only concerned with regulation and laws, but we have built over time a coordination structure, right? Which to me speaks to the kind of like notion that there is a kind of something beyond the de jure reality that matters here, right? And that at least this Ampur thinks matters to outcomes. So the head of one Ampur said to us, when they stop being residents, we stop being bureaucrats, with the implication that, essentially we need the people to be on board with what we're doing to move forward, that is what this job is about, right? Another Ampur said, my job is to take what is decided in Bangkok and unearth what we want and tell the Ampur and the Tamil, right? So I think, the quotes are slightly unfair in the sense that I suspect both might agree with the other one if presented on the survey, right? But the fact that this is what's salient about the job is, I think, interesting and different. There's also a diversity of inclusivity in these initial meetings. And I should say, by the way, I've been to 6 buildings, but I've only met with 5 Ampur because in one Ampur, the Ampur did exactly what at least 2 people in this room predicted all Ampur would do, which is didn't show up for the meeting, right? So, that is to say, we scheduled a meeting. The Ampur, the Ampur, did not appear at the appointed time and place despite confirming, right? So, and that's the kind of, and that speaks to a different kind of orientation based on the same stimulus, at least towards this task, which might not be representative of others. One Ampur spoke at great length about how his goal was to, I would describe it as teach people. People have bad practices, people have bad ideas. They need to be disabused of their wrong notions about how the world works, right? Other Ampur talk much more about the sort of need to promote welfare and to understand what people wanted and to help them get, right? These are different images of what it means to fulfill the kind of broader government mission of alleviating suffering. There's also, as I've talked about a few times, variation in internal coordination in implementation of this instruction. So this is the penultimate, the next to last slide. So, if I think about what things I'm particularly concerned about at the moment, though I suspect after your wise counsel, there will be new things I'm concerned about that I didn't know to be concerned about as I say this now. I'm particularly concerned with measuring outcomes and performance and how to do that well. I'm concerned with thinking rigorously about career concerns and the balance of motivation and tension between, right? So, we're going to talk about management practice and what people want, but obviously career concerns are a lot more nuanced than that. And they're differential by person and ministry here. So how can we think harder without it taking another hour about what career concerns constitute for each of these individuals in each of these ministries or each of these sort of bureaucratic roles. Also, something I'm just kind of inherently not very good at is thinking about alternative stories to differentiate from this account. So that is to say, if I come back to you in 3 months or 6 months or 2 years and say, here's my evidence, and that evidence looks something like motivational surveys, our perceptions of performance, the relationship between them, what questions are you going to have where you say, isn't this just X, right? This isn't motivation, isn't this just some other factor you're not thinking about? In part because your matching designs, maybe there's something we could have done better, it's an attempt to match, but it is not like we have randomly selected from a population, of 10,000 with the law of large numbers is going to work out. It's going to take out all the other differences. So, in conclusion, I think Thai and Ampur are pretty unique and interesting empirical settings for thinking about these things and a whole bunch more. I see a group of folks who at least I'm identifying as students in the room, and if I'm right about that, even if I'm not. So it seems to me that this is really rich fodder for lots more explanation, right? For lots more investigation. This is like a super interesting empirical setting for lots of questions that matter about welfare and performance and governance, but feels to me has not been even the 1% exploited in the sense of what it could teach us, right? I'd also really love your concerns, suggestions, guidance. What's interesting here that I've mentioned or not, or what have I talked about or stressed that you're like, that is not an interesting fact, That is something quite obvious that we should not spend a lot of time focusing on. And empirical strategies, right? What would you ask? How would you approach this? How would you get interest in this? Whatever you think. So thanks for your patience, and really look forward to listening. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan, for giving very nice structure for our seminar, right? And give some literature review for us. I believe that some of us not even in this field before, but I think it's very easy understanding in terms of providing that information, and then for some of our master students as well. And then also interesting topics. Interesting planning on studying performance, right? And then the motivation, mission driven in Thailand, and using content as a province that you are interested in. And then also I think it's kind of interesting to see. I think it's some of us actually just have seen this kind of the structure, the whole structure for this one. So I guess maybe our audience would have some more questions or some discussion that you want to ask. So please use the time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You made a very good observations in the transferring content. That's very good. And I totally agree with many of your findings and observations. But I have one comment and one question. My question, it might not fair to you, but I'm still curious that why you pick a Ampur-Level at your unit of analysis rather than a provincial level. Because in my opinion, at the provincial level, you might see a kind of small time state. It's a kind of, and lately there are many dynamics and many changes at the provincial level rather than at the Ampur-Level. Okay, that's my question. And as for my comments, I just like to add some observation with you already observe about the roles of the Ampur-Level bureaucrats, what they thinking about their job. I think one thing that I agree with you that one Ampur said that he had to work according to the Puwa say what he have to do or something like that. Because that's the way that Thai bureaucrats work. They never look into their area. They just look up to their superior. Because many field officers at the Ampur-Level, they have a very, very limited resources. Even the name that you mentioned about it, the officer of community, department of community development, department of livestock department, so on and so on. But there are only one officer there, right? And they have a very limited budget. Actually, they have no budget at all what they have to do, they have to follow the commands or some guideline from Bangkok or from provincial level. So they always look up neighbor. Even if they see some problem within the community and they want to do something about it, but it's a bit difficult for them to do something because at the end they have to perform the job according to guideline from Bangkok, command from Bangkok. Okay, that's all. Why? Why are those not
Maybe I could take a few comments and then.
Okay. Let me just start with this. I think your study is quite interesting. I wonder if you try to imitate the bigger structure, namely the top-down development or top-down bureaucrat with bottom-up development by using Ampur as a unit of analysis. Because when you use Ampur as a unit of analysis, you look at the administration, the motivation and so on. You cannot ignore that Ampur unit is not independent, as he mentioned, because the structure of government administration is a vertical one, you see, and Ampur has to take order from Minister of Interior ultimately. But at Ampur-Level, there are many other Ampur chief civil servants like agriculture, health and so on, which report directly to their superior, you see, at Jangwat and at the national level. And therefore to study this about the motivation and the mission, I think you cannot overlook the structure of command, the structure of administration, that Ampur is not the head of other, government offices at the Ampur level, but they have to report to their boss in Bangkok, namely the minister eventually. Okay, so this line will impact somehow your hypothesis of this vision and innovation. The other one that you cannot ignore is about the budgeting structure. The budgeting structure will tell you how Ampur can function, because eventually Ampur cannot function independently. Ampur cannot, control and manage all the budgets, because the budget will be earmarked to different, agencies, different ministries. Okay, so I think you ought to look at these two aspects: the structure of administration and the line of financial management. The other one, I think you cannot overlook the local government, because now by law, local government as a legal entity by Local Government Act already, but practically they are not, independent. They still have to depend on budget earmarked from the Department of Local Government Promotion, even though these grant from the central government. To me, I think it should be directly go to Ovatol directly, but it has to go through this Local Government Promotion Department. In other words, the Minister of Interior will have, a great impact on the local government, even though local governments are supposed to be independent.
Can I just
Will you
ask,
take this into account? Yeah.
Can I just ask for clarification? Sorry, which is so I think the point about the budgeting structure is super interesting, and I can imagine us adding questions that ask, sort of, where does your money come from? What kind of discretion do you have over it? And we should. On the other two things you pointed out, both the so I think we're sensitive to the existence of local government in whatever form it takes, right? And we're sensitive to the idea that people are reporting to different ministries in the way you suggested. would you have suggestions of kind of how to sort of get at what you think the interesting bits of that story are? So, the business end, practically, if we were to not ignore those things, which we very much do not want to, but rather ask good questions about them, what kind of good questions would you recommend asking that would help illuminate either of those things?
I guess
Yeah.
a point of clarification on this. The local governments at various levels now do have independent sources of revenue. It's not large, but it is independent. And that would probably be a good way to look at it, because that's the one thing that the head of the Ampur, I forget the term, yes, actually has a degree of control over. I know at the lower levels, the Puyaiban level, the Puyaiban for my village has some discretionary money that he can do stuff with. Some of it comes from the village, just a village tax. It's not on any book, but you pay it.
No.
But yeah.
Village chief nowadays do not have his power anymore. Let's go over to Obato.
Yeah, I know, but he still does. I mean, he does. As a practical, garbage collection in my village is handled totally voluntarily. Things like that. So, I mean, I would look at that. Look at where they have an independent source of money. And then see what they can do with that. Because I imagine that's what they fill a lot of cracks with.
Your points would be relevant for certain Obato where local tax, like property tax, is very huge, particularly in Samut Prakan, in Phuket, where there is an industrial, many industry sites in the area. So each year they receive several hundred million baht in terms of local property tax. But most of the Obato do not have this source of income. The property tax are very, very small, put it that way. That's why they have to rely on the grant from the central government.
Look, my understanding is it's about 15 to 20% overall, but it varies. It very much varies based mostly on the amount of industry that you have in the locality.
So I think that, just to respond to those series of comments, and so, I think the notion of where people perceive their revenues and their legitimacy to be coming from is a good one that we would do well to think more about. I think the notion of I still find myself feeling like there is probably untapped potential in thinking about the career concerns of the CDO to the department, right? And thinking about how to get at that more systematically. I will say that one of the reasons for choosing the Ampur, so Ampur versus Janwat, I think frames a lot of these comments in wise ways. So, first, I guess I have a preference, which might be unfounded, towards thinking about the closest contact of the central administration to the welfare of citizens, right? So, in a geographic sense, right? So, Wilson in his book Bureaucracy says when you want to understand bureaucracy, start at the interaction between the citizen and the bureaucrat. And it seems to me that one of the advantages of that is that this is recorded, yeah? This is that correct? One of the advantages of that is that I will put this differently. So one of the advantages of that is that citizens, it leaves less room for self-fabrication, right? It leaves less room. So that is to say, in my experience, middle bureaucrats at things like the province level, right, often can think things are working based on how things are going out to their own subordinates, right? So we are succeeding because we have instructed the people to do X, right? But whether the people are actually doing X, well, I don't know. We got to go somewhere else to see that. And so, I also quite like that in the Ampur, to this career concerns thing, which I think is very much at the center of what's interesting here. The fact that everyone is an office of one is hugely disadvantageous in terms of their budget and scope for independent action. It's hugely advantageous in thinking about career concerns and motivations, right? So that is to say, if you were in an office of 10 people and the other ministry is in an office of 10 people or 4 people, right? It's much easier to think about only the top-down channel, right, than it is if you're actually embedded in a kind of horizontal setting, I would argue, ceteris paribus, right? You know, I recognize, Ajahn-san, that you are like one of the experts on this, but at the risk of overwhelming hubris, you know, I certainly think I've seen evidence that every vertical bureaucrat we've talked to looks up to their superiors. But I might push back just a little bit on the idea that they just look up to their superiors, right? So everyone says if it's a guideline from Bangkok, we need to follow it, right? But some people end the story there, and some people say within the guidelines there's a lot we can do. Here's how we work to implement the guidelines. Here are the other things that happen, you know. So the idea that everyone looks up is to me very much part of the interesting setup here. But I think that there's still variation there. And if I'm honest, there's one kind of there's one kind of practical reason to work at the Ampur, which is frankly, one of the things that I've been surprised to realize is that when you talk to people in the ministry about the Ampurs, that is not threatening to them, right? The Ampurs are too little, right, for this to be something, you know, I mean, frankly, let's face it, let's understand who I am and, you know, what happens when I show up in a government office, right? And like, you know, trying to get access to the central deliberations of multiple provinces, I think would have been, to understand sensitive issues, right? And the way things are changing would, I think, have been somewhat more difficult, though I could be wrong about that. It's not like I gave it the college try.
If you have time, I think you might carry out the same nature of the study, but based on some successful overall.
Successful
look at the
Ampur rather than successful Ampur.
overall rather than Ampur, because some local government administration has been doing quite well.
Yeah.
You know, and from that you might link it to the welfare of local, you know, the local residents.
Yeah.
And that could be an example for the other tambols as well. You know?
I think that's wise. I mean, you know, and I think you're right. So to think, I also share the prior, which I believe is embedded there, that while variation in things like resources is going to explain some of the variation, it's not going to explain all of the variation.
And then eventually you might come to the point that overall should be independent.
Yeah, I would say
so then it will be a horizontal bureaucrat.
Yeah, I would say that one of my focuses here, so a question that comes up a lot, that lots of different people at lots of different levels have asked is, in some ways, is your research about why Thai local government as it's currently set up is bad and how it should change, right? I've been very careful to say that it's not, I do not anticipate making structural changing of the system arguments here, right? I'm interested in a managerial question, which is conditional on the system we're currently in. How can that system be made to function better? Which is a question I think we can ask everywhere. You know, happy to talk offline about my views on the independence of local government and its appropriate.
You're going to be giving questionnaires and stuff, correct? I think something that might be useful to track is where did people come from?
Yeah.
Have they been promoted up in that Ampur, or are they laterally transferring between them, etc.? Because I think that might vary depending on the different departments and the technical expertise required.
I think you're right. Also, the number of people who are from, so you meant from in a kind of like career concerns history of transfer sense.
Yeah.
There are also a surprising number of people who are from the place that they're working, right? So for central appointees, you know, I would have imagined that you would get almost no one who was from, you know, Thailand's a big country. There are a lot of provinces out there, a lot of Ampur, right? You know, but the number of people who are like, oh, I'm from this Ampur, or I'm from the neighboring Ampur, which, you know, it makes me wonder whether some ministries are compensating for a lack of kind of local embeddedness, right? By appointing people who are inherently embedded, right? Who can get more soft information. But of course, you know, as a classic, you know, principal agent framework concern would tell you, that I also would imagine that people from the local area are much more likely to, if there is tension, care about the local community rather than, kind of narrow career concerns. These are my people. This is my community. And so I think, but I agree that that's an interesting source of variation that we're going to be thinking.
I'd like to add something that yes, it's quite interesting because in the past, when you have to work outside Bangkok, at the community level, Ampur-Level, or provincial level, there's a kind of regulation that you cannot work at the city that you are in, that's your hometown. Because in the past, the roles of the Ministry of Interior and other are more concerned with the kind of law enforcement and other. So he or she might lack the integrity in their job because but recently this kind of thing changed a lot, especially in the Ministry of Interior. They try to promote someone to work in their hometown. I don't know why. Maybe you can do some research about it. But it's quite interesting. Even my student, he just finished his study at the faculty and he passed the examination to be a bureaucrat. And the first place that he from Sukhothai and he can work at his hometown. It never happened before. It just happened. I don't know when, but just recently. And another thing I like to add to my comment is for the past 2 or more decades at the Ampur-Level, their roles and importance to the Thai state is not so increased all the time. But just last year we have a new budgetary process act that's very important because one of the core idea of this new budgetary act is that they try to increase the role of what they call area-based budgeting. That's a new category because in the past the area-based office have a very, very limited resources, right? Most of the budget that go to the Ampur or provincial level is not a kind of block grant budget to the area-based officer, but is go there as a project that already decided in Bangkok. But the new budgetary act, they try to increase the portion of area-based budget, and at the community level, Ampur-Level and provincial level, they can make up a kind of area-based plan, and there's a kind of direct budget to this. And according to, but right now they are on the process of setting up a kind of mechanism to align with the new act. But as far as I know, is that the role of the Ministry of Interior, especially at the Ampur-Level, tend to be interesting because one of the core units to receive the budget is at the village level. And there's one mechanism that's set up by the Ministry of Interior is a village council headed by the village headman. And it's a core body at the village.
In every village?
At every village. They call it the village council.
What is it in Thai? In case we want to ask people that.
คณะกรรมการหมู่บ้าน
คณะกรรมการหมู่บ้าน
Right. And at the Thambun level, there are also a kind of Thambun council also headed by the Khana. This is a direct mechanism.
Thambun, not in the Obato.
No. The Sapanamon still exists. But the Obato is a local government. I understand, but in the past their role is decreased, but at the end they still function as part of the village committee or village council, and they gathering at the Thambun level under the company.
So let's say we wanted to ask people, let's say we wanted to ask the Nai Ampur and the Kuyaban and the Namnan, about this new area-based budgeting strategy, what would be the name under which they would understand it? You know what I mean? So like not the official regulation, but what would...
But so far, I think you can talk to them about the role of คณะกรรมการหมู่บ้าน
Okay, because it's going to flow through that structure.
Right. And this กรรมการ supposed to be a core unit to make a kind of community plan.
Interesting.
And this kind of system under on, I think the Ministry of Interior have their own system they call one plan. You can talk to the Ampur, you can talk to some high-ranking officer here in Bangkok about what is one plan. They call one plan in English, not in Thai, one plan. You can ask about it. And this one plan policy, the community, the คณะกรรมการหมู่บ้าน is part of this plan. And we expect that at the Ampur, Tambon andหมู่บ้าน they become more and more money from the new policy.
And I imagine, I mean, it seems to me that would change things particularly for the Tongtin Ampur, right? You know, so because now the job of intermediating between the Nai Ampur and the Gamnan is quite a different one, and it strikes me that that role, even in the way people describe it to us, is one both of it mixes empowerment and monitoring, right? And the monitoring component is going to be quite different when there are independent resources along the lines. It's super interesting. Thank you.
But another new development is that but I don't think you can say the Department of Local Administration and the Tongtin Ampur is part of this department. They try to propose to the government to split from Ministry of Interior. They want to have their own, to be a new Ministry of Local Government Promotion. But I don't think that it's going to succeed.
Okay then. So I think this is just a broad comment and maybe some kind of thing that I probably think you may want to think about. When you set up things, like you are supposed like all those things that theory you have review and experience in that kind of thing is set up nicely for for us to look into the issue of this mission motivation that the bureaucrat face, right? But when you start talking about the Thai case, I think it's starting to be complex and in the end I think when you go into that level of complexity, it's a bit like I feel like lose the bigger picture that you link back to your earlier framework setting, right? So my question, maybe my comment is it really necessary for you to go into this much complexity about Thai bureaucratic system? It's very complex, and I would suppose like not many people in Thailand really understand it. Yeah, and if you would it be better if you step back a bit and be, I would say, maybe use a rather different strategy, like be more targeted towards what you want to compare, rather than go on to explore things at the ground level. Just try to spot things, from many interviews that you have to do, right? I mean, if it's me, I would be, I know that you're a very energetic person and have plenty of energy. But if it's me, I wouldn't try to spend too much energy trying to go to the ground and spot different from the ground, because I would try maybe to use my energy trying to understand the structure that different bureaucrats that you are seeing are actually facing, right? So and to start with that different structure, like if different bureaucrats, like the chain of command is different, like people in health sector, people in educational sector, and maybe those bureaucrats who at the district, right, like the district officer, something like that. And if you spot the kind of different structure that shape the mission that they face are different, maybe then you can be a bit more targeted to find out how those different affect the way they work. And you don't have to spend as much energy now exploring everything within the Tambon, and this, I think it takes forever. And maybe, you know, like you don't have to, if you try to write about all this complexity, maybe in your paper or in your book, 70% about the understanding the complexity of Thai bureaucracy. Yeah, maybe.
I like it. Thank you for that. That's helpful. Frankly, if this audience finds the Thai bureaucratic structure a bit too complicated, too complex, then it's unlikely.
Economist.
He's an economist.
I think he is the only one in this room that understands the complexity of Thai.
I think that's probably right, including myself for sure. And so, you know, I would say that. You know, I think that idea of focusing on structure and chains of command and stepping back is a good idea.
Yeah.
You know, I'd love in particular. I'm just noticing we only have like 10 minutes left. I'd love your thoughts or anyone else's thoughts in particular on more general comments are very much of interest. I'd love in particular thoughts on measuring performance, right? The kind of left-hand side variable, right? And on whether a Surat Thani Konkan comparison is an interesting one, or, you know, to kind of along the lines you were pointing to. I mean, is the juice worth the squeeze, etc.
I would say no for that second part. If you're looking for differences, don't go Surat Thani. It's too much like Konkan. Go to a suburb of Bangkok. That's the big divide in Thailand. Bangkok, rest of country. And so there you might find differences. I don't have a strong sense, if you would, but I think it's more likely than Surat Thani. Is that correct?
I agree.
Okay.
Because what you see in Konkan is a kind of rural area. Even sometimes they're more urbanized, but the roles of the Ampur and the field officers might be totally different if you go to like Nonthaburi, Pathum Thani, or other. You may find something more interesting about the roles in the area.
But let me put it succinctly. The people in Konkan and the people in Surat Thani are far more like each other than they are like my students, and my students are far more like me than they are to people from either of those places.
And would you think that sort of central state commands are translated differently, or discretion operates differently in a place with different political orientations, I guess? Is part
Absolutely, probably, maybe.
What it means.
I think more likely, but I don't know that that might not be worth the squeeze.
Okay. Thank you.
They can probably tell you that.
Yes, exactly.
But this it's not really related to the question you asked, but, you know. But I think it's helpful as well. I mean, when you, I forgot to say this, when you want to understand the structure that the bureaucrats are facing, I think it's inevitable that you have to trace up. And when talking about trace up, I think, for example, you can remain at a district, right? You have to talk about who control the district as well. I think that you probably thought for this understanding, but you know, it's a lot about tracing the chain of command up to maybe even like people in Bangkok as well, and yeah, maybe that affects what you your strategy. Well, so it means like if it's me, then time spent in Surat Thani probably be better spent tracing things up to the people in Bangkok and in the district, which I'm sure going to affect, you know, people who are working at the district level as well. Yeah. measuring performance.
Yeah, measuring performance maybe.
I don't know yet.
One last leg of my.
Mapping of the bureaucrat, right?
Yes, exactly. Or of the Ampur as a whole.
How do you have any data that can measure performance of bureaucrat in district level?
Count the potholes, the roads.
Count the whole bureau.
That's not a terrible idea. so is there some service that, I mean, sort of like treating that as a whiteboard space, right? So is there some service that varies quite a lot, right? So like potholes, like, I don't know, garbage collection, since that was mentioned earlier, where we could observe something that people have this expression on the business school side, managerial time, right? So that means like something that could have been affected within the time of current management, right? So something that varies quite rapidly. So if a new Ampur comes in and destroys everything, we would imagine it would decline quickly, right? And is in the remit of this team as a whole. Is there some kind of observable indicator that we could frankly have RAs count? You know, so like, here's one thing that I definitely think is not the right answer, but struck me. A number of Ampur have a number of non-working toilets, right? So like, it strikes me that like, that exists in managerial time and says something about functioning, right? So like how many, you know, that's not the right answer either, but I'm just pointing towards, you know, are there examples of things like that that come to mind?
Tax collection. How good are they at tax collection?
Is tax collection, isn't there a separate revenue district officer who is going to be in charge of tax collection? Let me know if I'm wrong about that.
Not the Ampur-Level.
All right. Well, as brilliant ideas come to you in future, please don't hesitate. My email's up there for a reason. And let me just say, you know, if there are no other thoughts or questions, I know we're coming to time. So let me just say thank you very, very much for all this wisdom and your patience. And you know, this is obviously very, very much a work just at the beginning of progress, and really appreciate the opportunity to get your inputs into it. And thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan, for giving us a good seminar today, and thanks for all the audience for good discussions. All right. Thank you.